Okay, I think we're going to get started. My name is Michael Colatrella. I'm the 11th Dean of the McGeorge School of Law at the University of the Pacific. Welcome to this event. I'm just going to say a few words, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Erin O'Neill, who's the moderator, and she'll introduce the panel. I first want to announce, and this event is serendipitous in that we have been voted by the National Jurist as the #1 government law program in the country. Wow. This is the second year in a row that we have been voted, tied with the University of Pennsylvania and New York Law School. And I want to thank Erin O'Neill, who's been very instrumental in that. Let's just give her a round of applause. And Megan Hammer, who's also one of the coordinators of the program. Megan. And not least of all, the Capitol Board. We have an amazing board of alumni who help guide this Capitol Center. They help inform the events that we hold. They support our students. If you're a board member in here, could you just raise your hand? Thank you to you. And of course, I want to thank Michael Belote. Michael Belote sponsors this. This is the Michael Belote Capitol Center Symposium Forum, and with his generous support, we've been able to do these kinds of events throughout the last few years. So please welcome and thank Michael Belote. Where's Michael? There he is. Thank you, Michael. So I'm going to read the title. I think I have it down. It was a long one, but before I read it, I'll just say to you, Professor Erin O'Neill came to me, and she's the one who sort of generates some of these ideas. She follows all this very closely. And she said, how about this interaction that's going on between the state and the federal government? And this is several months ago, right? And let's just say a lot has happened since then. So she was prescient in thinking like, hey, this is happening in California in particular. It's a really interesting issue. But I know the panelists have quite a lot to talk about. Let's just say that. We're going to be here. I don't know if you know, we've changed it to midnight. So if you have plans, you might want to cancel them. So again, here's the title. It's Combat Cooperation, Contradiction, the Balance of Power Between States and Federal Government in the Era of Transactional Federalism. There's a lot there. That's what they're going to unpack for you today. We have an incredible panel, and I want to thank them for their generosity of being here. We have people who follow it in the media. We have people who are following it at an academic level, and we have people here who are actually in the trenches and really in the combat cooperation of the moment. And so that is a special combination that I hope you enjoy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Erin O'Neill.
Thank you, everyone, so much for being here this evening. As Michael mentioned, Dean Colatrella, this is quite a significant topic at this time. I first started thinking about this when the LA fires happened, and we saw an interaction with the federal government putting conditions on emergency aid, something we hadn't seen before in the context of federalism and the relationship between the states and federal government. And I started thinking things are really shifting here. And this panel is uniquely qualified to speak about these topics. One of the things that I try to do every year with the Belote Lecture is to bring about a variety of perspectives, folks who are academically looking at the issues, policy people who are in the trenches, as Dean Colatrella said, and I always love to have a journalistic perspective as well. So I'm very thankful to this group for joining us this evening. We have a fantastic panel. California Attorney General Rob Bonta is here with us this evening. We have Catherine Lhamon, professor and executive director of the Edley Center for Law and Democracy at Berkeley Law, is joining us. Melanie Mason, who is the California Bureau Chief for Politico, California. Zach Price, who is a professor of administrative and constitutional law at UC San Francisco Law, UC Law San Francisco. And finally, last but not least, Wendy Weiser, who is Vice President of Democracy for the Brennan Center at NYU Law School. So to kick things off tonight, we had a meeting ahead of our discussion kind of talking about the different topics that we wanted to address, and as has been alluded to, more than we can possibly fit in the time that we have together. But building off the title of the event, cooperation, contradiction, combat, all of these different elements that we're seeing inform the relations between the state and federal government, what in your work makes you think that this moment is unique, that it may shape the direction of policy going forward and relations between the state and federal governments? And I'll start with you, Melanie. We'll just go down the line for this one.
Let's start with the person without a law degree. But I did get a really good LSAT score that I'm happy to brag about privately, so feel free to ask since I never got to use it. I think that's a fascinating question in part because I think all three C's, the combat, the cooperation, and the contradiction, we've all seen play out in a very short period of time. I think from my vantage point as a journalist, I think a lot about what we're seeing projecting from our elected officials that we cover, and I have noticed a marked shift. I do think that at first, the tone that we were hearing was one of cooperation. I think a sense that if this incoming administration was coming in, that for reasons like you mentioned, the Los Angeles fire aid and things like that, why poke the bear? Why get things started off on the wrong foot? And of course, we have seen markedly that tone change, particularly, I would say, with our governor, Governor Newsom, and I think really with politicians across the board. And the one sort of, I think, thing that crystallized that for me or distilled this is the night of the election. So in November of 2024, I was at the California Democratic Party. They had their election night party in Los Angeles. As you can imagine, there were not a lot of happy faces there. And I'm sure, Mr. Attorney General, that you don't remember, but you and I actually spoke. And what you had said to me is, we're ready for this. We have, we have briefs that we have prepared. We have things that we can take off the shelf. And that was actually very different than what I was hearing from the other Democrats at the time. When I was talking to them about how they were processing this moment, I think that what I heard from Democrats is, in Trump 1.0, Democrats over-indexed on the resistance and perhaps forgot about maybe tending to some of the issues at home. And so you heard a lot about maybe it's best that California look inward, maybe cleaning up our own house is the best way to sort of espouse progressive values. And I think that what we've seen over the past year and change is that more and more elected officials have moved more towards what we heard from the Attorney General. And I think that this idea of, the resistance 2.0 coming in, I would say even stronger, was certainly not something that we were hearing, at least on election night. So I think that just that evolution, I think, is part because people were reacting in real time to what we were seeing from the Trump administration. But I also think it's reflective of what they were hearing from their constituents. And the truth is I think a lot of times the constituents were out ahead of the electeds with what they wanted to see, the type of fight that they wanted to see. And so I think we saw them catch up and then maybe go beyond where the constituents are.
Well, first of all, let me just thank Aaron for having me. It's a real honor to be here. So I want to set some general themes up, maybe. I think there are some unique features of this administration and the way it's interacted with the states. In particular, this administration has stronger executive control over spending than I think has been the norm, and that's meant imposing conditions on funds going to states, sometimes withholding them as a way of getting policy leverage. So there are definitely some new things going on, but I also think they fit into a broader trend, which is the way in which federalism has come to operate in very partisan fashion. As no doubt you're aware, the country has a pretty acute, nationwide, polarized partisan divide, and that shapes the way all kinds of things work. It shapes the way separation of powers work, but it's also really importantly shapes the way federalism operates. We're all familiar with the blue state, red state idea. Because of differences in political geography, one party or the other tends to control states pretty consistently. And the way states interact, and states in the two camps follow pretty different governance models along many dimensions, and they try to shape federal policy to align with those competing models. And I think the end result is that you see states behaving very cooperatively towards the federal government when they're sort of aligned in terms of the policy agenda, and in a very adversarial, conflictual way when they're not aligned. So, 18 months ago, that was Texas and the federal government. Right now, it's California and the federal government. It creates important checks and balances and constraints, but also leads to a lot of kind of bare-knuckle maneuvering and not always the most enlightened approaches to governance. So I think we're dealing with a pre-existing trend that is maybe particularly acute right now in this administration, and particularly right here in California.
I'll echo the thanks and the gratitude for pulling us together, and it's terrific to be up here with colleagues and friends, and also to see all of your commitment to making sure that we get right how we respond now. So thank you for coming tonight. I'll add to what my colleagues have said so far, just to say that I think what is most striking about this time is the everywhere, all at once breadth and scope of the very transparent corruption from a federal government. And I don't say that limited to or even particularly focused on financial self-dealing, although we also see that, but the brazen tearing of public confidence that our government works for us and that our government is responsive to our needs, and the breaking of public trust that we see. I think we all are familiar with the notion that when a candidate is elected to office, we all have an expectation that that candidate will pursue policies which we may agree with or disagree with, but that is something that is wholly unsurprising that we would see from this president. But what is different is that this president eschews every form of legal access to pursuing those policies. That we have a president who has said what he wants to do, and then he just does it, notwithstanding legal guardrails, notwithstanding any of the accepted legal means for regulating, asking Congress to pass a law, directing executive agencies to enforce consistent with the policy preferences of the president, and then persisting in litigating. Instead, we have a president who acts on whim, and we have the persistent insistence that regulated entities, that states and also recipients of federal funds, operate consistent with that whim or themselves bear the burden of having to litigate and to challenge what it is that the president is doing, while the president and his administration flout the law in flagrant ways. And so that persistence in using and misusing those tools across every scope of governance is unprecedented in our history, has meant that we are living through the speediest democratic decline in any nation ever in the history of the world. So it's incredibly dangerous for us. And it also means that it's incredibly important that we find ways to respond consistent with the law, to rebuild public trust, and to remind all of us how to be democracy defenders and how to live in a time that is more productive. And so I'm excited to be in conversation about those today.
So thank you all for being here and for this excellent panel. And I concur with everything that the previous panelists have said. I wanted to focus on a little bit of what is, I think, unique in the relationship between the federal government and the states, which draws out of some of what is unique in this political moment and of the actions of this administration. But one aspect that has been infecting a lot of my work and a lot of what's going on is the sheer extent to which the administration is trying to control the state, and the states and the sheer number of tools they are using to directly usurp state powers or to indirectly control states, and often using powers that we're trying to get states to do things that the federal government doesn't have the authority to have states do, but using other powers in a way to try to extort compliance with policy preferences or to benefit political friends and penalize political foes. That is, in part, also a result of, it's not just the relationship between the federal government and the states. It's really a consolidation of federal power in the executive that is driving that. And I think, in the past, we used to think of federalism problems as is Congress, stepping on state prerogatives and legislating. The powers that usually the federal government exercises are principally derived from Congress's powers under Article 1 of the Constitution, but we have a lot of unilateral action by the executive branch, not only taking some of the powers that Congress has, but using those to exert that power over the states. And so it is a consolidation of power from the states and from Congress into the executive, which is part of this story of democratic decline and the breakdown of the rule of law. That in turn helps to facilitate this corruption that Catherine's mentioning, where that power can be used to advance personal agendas or personal political agendas or benefit personally the members of the executive and people close to them, and that again it is that consolidation of power and the breakdown or the erosion of that balance in our system of checks and balances, and that leads to targeting of individuals, targeting of states in that way as well. The one other thing I wanted to just start with as a unique moment of the checks and balances is actually the coordinated response that has been so effective coming from so many in the states, and especially from our attorneys general, that has actually been a real bright spot and a bulwark against this rapid decline that we're talking about. And I think that as we think about the level of coordination that we're seeing now and the level of action coming out of the states and coming out of state attorneys' offices is also unprecedented and something to celebrate.
Hi, everybody. Rob Bonta, California Attorney General. Let me just start out with some appreciation. Thank you to Aaron O'Neill. Shout out my middle school classmate at Winston Churchill Middle School back in the day.
Absolutely right.
Here in Sacramento. Thank you to the law school and the dean and Mr. Belote, of course, for bringing us together. Honored to be on this panel with these incredible panelists. And also just a special message to our law students. You are in a special place right now, and that what you're learning and the training that you're doing, what you're going to be able to do to affect your world, if you look out in our world and you think things are unfair or unjust or not acceptable or not normal, and you want to do something about it, you are preparing yourself to have an incredible role in changing the future. And I've often been asked by people who are in college, who are thinking about their future, and they ask me if they should go to law school. And they wonder if it's worth the 3 years, the debt, and the commitment, and I always say yes. And I also say you got to make a decision for yourself about your family, your future. It is a mountain of debt. We have a broken system with the way our student loans work, but you will never regret the training and the skills and your ability to shape this world for the better that you will get from law school. So I'm excited for you, whatever you do next, and I'm grateful to be in this place and space with you right now. When it comes to the question around sort of the tension with the federal government, I just want to be clear about how I see this moment and who is doing what. There is not a moral equivalence here. It's not both sides doing things that had gotten to where we are today. It emanates from the federal administration, from the Trump administration, from the White House, with very extreme views about what the law allows, or maybe not caring about what the law allows. They have this unitary executive view. They take this idea of impoundment, meaning impounding congressional funding to be that they're Congress and that the courts can't stop them, and that states are a speed bump on the pathway for advancing their agenda. And our nation is founded on a document that by design, deliberately and intentionally, spreads the power and doesn't allow it to be unified in one area. And that's why we have horizontally the separation of powers between legislature, executive, and judicial. And that's why we have vertically the rights of states. And right now, we are definitely being stress tested as a nation. And I've often said, this is, the Constitution is built for this. It has foreseen this. It experienced this in its founding. The one thing that the Constitution says, if it doesn't say anything else, it's a lot of articles and a lot of sections and a lot of clauses. But the one thing it stands for is we shall never have a king. We shall never have a tyrant. We shall never have a monarch. And that's what it's defending against right now. And it's I know people are worried and anxious, and I want to acknowledge that. I get worried and anxious sometimes too, and that fuels me and it pushes me and it inspires me to do more. But our system is holding firm in this moment. And the federal administration is trying to withhold funding that the branch of government that decides on funding, that has the power of the purse, that has the power to spend and appropriate, that they decide. And they've made the decision. They've passed budget bills, and presidents have signed them, and they are the law. And Trump is coming in and saying, no, I don't want that money to flow. I definitely don't want it to flow to blue states, and I definitely don't want it to flow to California. We've brought 65 cases against the Trump administration in less than 65 weeks. We're averaging more than one per week. And it's not because we want to sue Trump once per week. We didn't get into some war room before Trump was inaugurated and say, how can we sue this man once a week? Honestly, I want to sue him never. If I never sued him, then that would mean he's following the law and complying with the Constitution, and that would be great for our entire nation. But we have a position, which is if you break the law, if you trample on the Constitution, and you hurt California in the process, meaning we are injured and we have standing and we can go to court for a remedy, we will sue you every time. No passes. You don't get to sometimes break the law. You never get to break the law. And we are winning 80% of the time in our cases. We are getting temporary restraining orders, preliminary injunctions, final judgments. Sometimes Trump just throws in the towel, waves the white flag, and says, I give. We'll do the thing that you're telling us we need to do in your lawsuit. And so the tension flows from an administration that is acting beyond its authority. The President of the United States is probably the most powerful person in the world, the most powerful elected official in the United States of America. There is so much the President of the United States can do within the constitutionally granted authority that he or she has. But he can't exercise Congress's authority. He can't blow by and ignore the judicial branch. He can't infringe upon state sovereignty. But he's done it time and time again. And half of our cases of those 65 are about Trump trying to withhold from California funding that's already been congressionally appropriated to us. We have protected $200 billion with a B of funding that Trump has tried to withhold from us. He continues to do it. I've called him a repeat offender. He is a repeat lawbreaker. And it is blatant, it is brazen, it is consistent, it is frequent. He is told by a court that he can't do it, then he does it again, and then he's told by another court he can't do it. And it's rinse and repeat. And we have to go to court and stop him every time. He has tried to rewrite the Constitution with executive orders. He did it on day one, like he jumped in the pool the day of his inauguration, signed an executive order that tried to rewrite the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution and undermine birthright citizenship. And people are like, whoa, it's an executive order. It's on a formal piece of, formal document. It's the President of the United States. And that does not have the authority of law. The Constitution trumps everything. Sorry to say trumps. And he tried to impose tariffs against every single trade partner of ours. Tariffs are taxes. Congress has the power to tax. Congress can clearly delegate the authority to the president if they wish to delegate that authority. Trump relied on a statute, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, that doesn't mention the word tariffs. Was never been used to impose tariffs in nearly its 50-year existence, and yet he thought he could have these global tariffs against all of our trade partners. We sued the states, Democratic states, let me be clear. The Republican states have not lifted a finger to hold accountable a president who is taking millions and sometimes billions of dollars in funding from their states, trampling over the constitutional rights of their people. I have a theory that the Republican states are secretly rooting for the Democratic states. Because when we sue and we win, we protect their funding, we protect their rights, and they don't have to stand against their dear leader publicly in a lawsuit. But we went all the way to the US Supreme Court, and the tariffs were struck down. He has no authority to impose those tariffs. He had no authority to federalize the California National Guard and deploy them in Los Angeles. Yet he tried. He relied on 10 U.S.C. 12406, a statute that says when there's a rebellion, when there's an invasion, when there's an inability to execute the federal laws with the regular forces, you can federalize the National Guard and deploy them. None of those prerequisites existed. He loves emergency powers. That's why he's always declaring emergencies. There's no factual basis to the emergency, but he likes the power that would come if there really was an emergency because he can have those powers. And so it's all sorts of gaslighting and lying, just like, war-ravaged Portland, he would talk about in his tweets. And then you'd see the photos of the dancing, costumed people and anything but a war-ravaged city. So those are some examples of just the incredible overreach by the federal government. And yes, it's created tension, because when you act unlawfully and unconstitutionally and you hurt our states, we're going to do something about it. We're going to see you in court. We speak the language of the law and the facts. We love the courts. They're sanitized, apolitical spaces where we can present the law, present our case, and we can win, as we have 80% of the time. But there's also areas where the law doesn't do all the work, where there is discretion that the president has, and he's blowing through and blowing up norms that have lasted for a long time, like the norm that when you're the president of the United States and any state, no matter who's there, no matter if it's a red state or a blue state, if it's Americans in that state and they've suffered from a natural disaster, send them to disaster relief. You don't need to leverage it for something else, for some new water policy or for some new elections law policy. Everything is a negotiation. Everything is leverage. Instead of just doing what's right for the American people and giving the funding when people's houses have burned down and they're on the street and they need food and they need clothing and they need shelter, you don't ask, are you a red state or a blue state? Are you Republican or are you Democrat? You ask, are you an American who needs help? You get it. Period, full stop. And he's changing that. So I think that while there's a lot of tension right now, I don't think any of it's permanent. I think this is unique to him. I think it is a pathway that he demonstrated to a lesser degree in Trump 1.0, and he's put it on steroids in Trump 2.0. The scope, the scale, the speed of his unlawful actions have at least doubled. My California Attorney General's office, I wasn't the AG at the time, it was AG Becerra at the time, during Trump 1.0 brought 120 lawsuits against the Trump administration. Most of them were actually environmental, interestingly. We are on pace to hit 120 later this year, and we'll do it in half the time. And I don't like that. That means that more harm is being visited on people, more damage is being done to the Constitution and the rule of law, more fights need to be fought that are completely avoidable. This is created by an administration that has decided to act in this way. So finally, I want to just end with this. The bosses of Mr. Trump are not his billionaire buddies or greedy corporations. They are you and me and us and we, the people. We are the ones who will have the last word. There are more chapters to write about what happens in California, what happens in the United States of America, and we're going to write them. But we have to be active. We have to be engaged. You're here. You're active. You're engaged. You're at this panel listening to folks talk about the future of our nation. So I'm speaking to the choir. But if we elevate our voices and make sure that we stay engaged and stay enraged about these abuses of power, that we don't act hopeless because we're not helpless, because we have agency and we can make tomorrow more fair and more just than today, then I believe it's inevitable that we will get past this time of tension, this time of lawlessness at the federal administration and unconstitutionality, and get to days that are more fair and more just and delightfully boring, where we're not having this tension all the time. But it requires us to be engaged and to exercise our voices with the most potent power that there is in a democracy, people power. So no pressure to all of you and all of us, but we need to keep pushing and keep demanding more and better, and refuse to accept the unacceptable and refuse to normalize what's so abnormal. These are not normal times, but we have many ways to respond, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit about what my office and my fellow Democratic Attorneys General, 24 by the way, Democratic AGs, we started with 23, we had a pickup in Virginia this year, and I do remember that conversation that we had in LA the night of the election, and we had been preparing for months for the possibility that Trump could be elected. It wasn't my preference at all, but I knew it was possible, and so we believed we owed our constituents readiness, preparedness, a plan of action, so that should it happen, and the president did act unlawfully as he did in Trump 1.0, we would be ready. And we have looked at Project 2025, we listened to everything he said on the campaign trail, everything, we take him at his word. We believe he'll do it if he says he'll do it, and we believe we should be ready for it. And so we have We've had briefs that have been written. We just need to dot the i's, cross the t's, press print, and file them. That has come in handy when the National Guard came to LA, when the tariffs were imposed. There's some things he hasn't done yet that we're ready for. We don't want him to do it. We hope we'll never have to use those briefs, but we're ready, and we think that's an appropriate way to be a responsible elected leader's office for the people of California. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Attorney General. And Zach, I'm going to direct this one to you. So we've all kind of talked a little bit about these new rules of transactional federalism and the idea that states that align with the federal government tend to get funding, policy, benefits, and states that oppose tend to get pushback from the federal government. So can you talk a little bit about what is the appropriate balance of power between the states and federal government? Are states meant to be a check on the federal government, and what are the ramifications if that's not the case? And I guess also, and this one, is for the whole panel, do we consider that in this time of polarization that we see ourselves in, that there may be a shift in norms going forward? Is this transactional federalism going to persist even if the administration changes in the context of a polarized, even different party administration? How might that look?
Yeah, well, great set of questions. I mean, to begin with, the big quick question of the balance of federal and state power, I mean, that what the ideal balance should be is something that's been debated from the country's founding. It's very hard to answer in the abstract, but I think part of how we've ended up where we are now is that the trend for about the past 100, 125 years has been to strengthen the federal government, understand its powers broadly, build up powerful federal agencies, and kind of shift a lot of policymaking primacy to the federal government. And so a key way in which federalism works in this context is often what is called cooperative federalism, where the federal government is providing funds and setting up some program, but then the states are actually administering it, giving out the money. So that gives states leverage in a lot of ways. They're kind of on the ground administering federal policy. But on the other hand, it also gives the federal government leverage over the states. And I think what you're seeing right now is a kind of renegotiation of how that works. And where it leads, I don't know, but we do tend to see a pattern. I mean, President Trump, again, is quite brazen in his expansive claims of executive authority. But again, this is part of a long-term trend where presidents have been breaking norms, pushing legal boundaries. You've seen this across all recent administrations. I think there are structural reasons why that is happening. Trump is pushing on this envelope, this boundary, and states are pushing back. And I think he won't. There will be some checks imposed, but part of the pattern is, when one administration does something, others tend to build on that example, try and pull some of the same levers. So it wouldn't be surprising at all if you see presidents from both parties using some of these tools in the future. So I guess then just a last point about the federalism and the checks. I do think that, as the Attorney General was saying, I think our system is sort of set up on the assumption that rivalrous relationships will kind of promote legality and good governance overall. So it's sort of designed to be conflictual in some ways. It's not always pretty, but I think the states, for better or worse, are a key dimension of that sort of conflict. And so, the federal government keeps states in check. The states keep the federal government in check. It produces a lot of conflict, but I do think it is a key way in which our system is resilient and resists consolidation of power and kind of collapse of democratic norms altogether and that sort of thing.
Thank you, Zach. Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I will disagree a little bit with what you just shared. I think that it's certainly true that recent presidents in the last several presidencies have accreted to themselves more and more executive authority. But the degree of lawlessness that we see now is unprecedented in our history. And I think that those are not comparable. And the assumption of authority that our Constitution doesn't give to the president, our laws don't give to the president, our Congress doesn't give to the president, nobody gives to the president but the president in that assertion of it now is totally unprecedented. And I think that we will see it continue if we don't block it. But we have democracy guardrails now if we're willing to use them. So it's important to know what they are. It's important to know what the law is. It's important to follow the model that we heard the Attorney General talk about at some length about suing the federal government. That's insisting that we actually live by the rule of law, that we actually live within our guardrails. And that is, a version of that authority is available to all of us, whether or not we are the Attorney General of a state. You know, we are able to say no when the federal government tells us to do something that the law does not command, that the federal government has no right to tell us to do. And I think it's important for us to remember that dissent is patriotic, that it is important to work for the public good, it is important to stand for each other, and we will continue to see the kind of lawlessness that we live now from the federal government if we don't operate as the bulwarks that we can be against it. So I am incredibly grateful and proud to be a resident of the state of California, where the state of California is fighting so hard, and I invite all of us to use the tools that we have ourselves as well to stop that degree of lawlessness and to say no to it, because that's what voting means. That's what it means to when somebody tells you to do something that is not lawful to do, to exercise your power to say no to it and to push against that lawlessness, which you still can do, and which we can expect our universities to do, which we can expect our nonprofits to do, which we can expect our public and private corporations to do. These are all things that we ought to be asking for as residents of the state, as residents of this country, and as participants in our democracy.
I'll just briefly add, I think that thinking of all of the checks and balances in our system are really important, and ensuring that they are all activated. And it is true, it is beyond states, federal, it's beyond Congress as a potential check. It is all of our institutions, including our law schools and the public, that can be checks against abuse in power. We have been insufficiently attentive to the erosion of the guardrails around our democracy and against centralization of power and abuse of law. And I think we will have an opportunity for reform and renewal, and to think about this in the future, and maybe we'll get to this later in the panel, but I do think this is the time to actually commit ourselves to when there is that opportunity, we need to take it and make sure that these holes through which we're seeing these real strains on our democracy emerge are closed up, and we emerge stronger going forward, and come with new systems in place. The other key check that I want to say and key institution is elections and the public, and that is and that can't be understated. Not just elections, other public mobilization. That makes a big difference whenever you see abuse of power. We saw in Minnesota what happened when people mobilized, how that built up pressure that ultimately led to the administration standing down. Elections and voting are similar. Like, that's the main vehicle through which we, the people, actually can communicate what we think and the direction that we want to see the government turn, and we should not lose sight of those. We'll talk a little bit about the strains on those, but that is a critical check that we do have right now, and that is more powerful than all these other institutions combined.
I'll just say I don't worry too much about the precedents being set by this unprecedented administration being durable and being, setting the new norms. I think they're a unique spike in unlawful activity and politically unpopular activity that will be rejected and will move in a different direction after his term is over. So maybe I'm a little overly hopeful even in saying when his term is over, but I'm hardwired hopeful, and I think that the American people are gonna, our will is gonna prevail here, and our Constitution is gonna hold firm. But I will say this: when it comes to Trump's actions that are unprecedented, some are either unlawful and so struck down in the court of law, or some are unpopular and rejected in the court of public opinion. And he is losing badly in both courts now. He is losing regularly and consistently in the court of law, and his polls are in the tank now on the issues where, you know, he's changing norms, but they might not be unlawful. And, you know, people are really worried about affordability. And he said, I'm going to lower costs on day one. And he literally worked overtime to impose tariffs that were unlawful, that he could have just said, I don't need to impose the tariffs because they're not lawful, and not impose them to raise costs for American people. And then as people are paying higher costs, and the studies show $1,000 to $2,000 per American household per year in increased costs, he's saying, you guys aren't paying for them. These other countries are paying for them. Like gaslighting people who know what their own pocketbooks say and know what the costs that they're paying are. He's completely abdicating responsibility when it comes to corporate consolidation and doing antitrust analysis. He's picking winners and losers on mergers and corporate consolidation. We are in trial right now with Ticketmaster Live Nation. We are investigating Paramount Warner Brothers, and we just launched a suit on Nexstar Tegna. And so the federal government usually takes a leadership role in that space. They have stood down and stood back when it comes to that space. He just got us into an international conflict in Iran, which has raised prices at the pump, already too high for many, another $1. So some of those things he can do, like we can't force him to do antitrust enforcement. We did strike down the tariffs, but he came back the day the Supreme Court struck him down with a new set of unlawful tariffs, sort of following the old adage, if at first you don't succeed in imposing unlawful tariffs, try again. And so his polls are in the tank. And that's where, you know, political choice and political bodies, elections matter. Who knows what will happen in the primary election? There's still some weeks between now and then, and you know, if I've learned nothing being in politics, I know that things can change quickly. But where things are today, his agenda is being rejected in courts of law and courts of public opinion. I don't think people will look back at that and say, okay, I want to adopt those as new norms then. I want to punish the states that subscribe to another political philosophy, even though they're Americans, and not give them funding that they deserve. Or I want to brazenly break the law and spend my time in the administration losing in court. I just don't think people will do that. And I think people want to course correct. Presidential elections are often like that. The next president, you'd look for something that the former president wasn't. And I think there's going to be ample opportunity for that in the next presidential election. And I don't think any of these unprecedented actions that he's taken will turn into norms with any durability.
Yeah, I might push back on that optimism a little bit, because that's my job as the journalist. I think anytime norms are changed, it's really hard to then say that you're going to swing back to before those norms were broken. And I do think that what I hear, at least from Democratic voters, Democratic constituents, when they look at how Trump and the Republican Party is exercising power, they certainly do not like what they are doing. But I always there's a little bit of a tinge of jealousy, right? Of like, the Democrats don't do that. There's a lot of, I think, frustration with Democratic voters right now at their own party, because I think that they want to see, in some ways, that kind of that fight, whatever that is. Do they want it exactly how Trump is? No, I think Trump is sort of a singular figure. But let me give you an example of how I think norms have changed and how they can continue to change. The redistricting measure that we had last year. California approved an independent redistricting commission, mostly from Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents. Of course, there were Republicans who liked that as well. But this was something that if you polled Democratic voters, they love an independent redistricting commission. And in fact, when Governor Newsom's team initially did this poll of, should we proceed with this redistricting measure, it was underwater because Democratic voters like their independent redistricting commission. They don't like the idea of giving that power back to the lawmakers. And yet, when this was framed more as a manifestation of fight, more as a manifestation of going up against the president, the flip you saw from Democratic voters and Democratic-leaning independents was immediate and pretty striking. And the fact that that initiative passed so heartily I don't think that this isn't talking about the merits of whether this was, justified. I think that there's obviously, you would hear a lot of people talk about what happened with Texas and that this is a response, and I think all of that is very, very fair points. But my point is that you saw voters change their norms because in response to what they've seen in the environment. And so I am going to be really interested going forward in the 2028 Democratic presidential primary of like, what is the way that these presidential aspirants are going to appeal to Democratic voters? Are they going to say, we got to get back to where we were? Is there somebody who's going to run on kind of we need a Watergate-style reform package to sort of bring us back? We now know where all of our points of vulnerability are, and we've got to plug those holes. Or is somebody going to say, we saw what happened when the other side has a fighter, and I will be the fighter now? I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out about what actually sort of touches on what the voters want to see. And I'm not in the prediction business, but it's certainly going to be the theme that I'll be looking ahead to for the next couple of years.
Thank you, Melanie. And building off of all of that, I'm going to turn this one to Wendy. With the upcoming midterm elections, we see the federal government stepping into spaces that have been traditionally occupied by the states in terms of election administration, redistricting, access to voter records. What are the antecedents for this? What are the ramifications for this? And what does it mean if the federal government gets involved in a more national way in terms of federal elections?
So what we're seeing right now in terms of the federal government getting involved in elections, not just that it's unprecedented, it's also unlawful. We actually, the Constitution is quite clear as to who gets to determine how elections are run. It's actually the only place that gives a very specific power to states to determine election regulations, and it gives Congress the power to legislate nationally to override those, but the president has no role in that. And pursuant to the laws passed by Congress and the states, it's states and localities that actually run elections. And yet what we've seen this year is a very concerted and high-octane effort by Trump and the Trump administration to try to take control of elections, to try to meddle in them in many ways from day one. I mean, from pardoning all of the January 6th defendants to issuing a sweeping executive order purporting to regulate voting, big aspects of voting nationwide, to trying to sweep up the voter rolls across the country, to trying to seize election ballot equipment in Fulton and County, Georgia, and elsewhere. There's been a pretty relentless campaign backed by claims of assertion of authority over elections, claims of potential emergency powers, claims that the states are just the president's agents when it comes to counting and casting of votes, and that he has the ability to just take over the elections, or that Republicans should just take over the voting. So this is clearly a concerted campaign. It is actually as a legislative priority, which is a little different because Congress actually does have the power to pass legislation. The president had said it's his #1 priority. He's not going to sign anything else unless and until Congress passes this very misguided SAVE Act. It is a vote suppression and otherwise election interference bill currently pending in the Congress. But this is a #1 priority. And why? Because elections are one of the principal and most powerful checks on the assertion of power and the accretion of power and by the president, and so weakening elections, gaining control over elections can allow you to potentially challenge or control the outcomes, and that's what you see in other societies that have experienced like significant democratic turnaround is somehow taking control of elections. They don't get canceled. You still see things. People show up and vote and do things that appear to be elections, but the outcomes are controlled because they are meddled with. That's the bad news, and it's been happening relentlessly. And the government has, and they're threatening also to send troops, ICE, all these other things. The good news is, as with all these things, the law is on the voter's side. The law is on the side of free and fair elections. All of these things are unlawful. And so there is a real strong hand to push back against this. And also, this is all very unpopular. And even, in many cases, even Republican secretaries of state are refusing to comply with efforts to sort of turn over full unredacted voter rolls with people's private information and voter history and driver's license numbers. So there's a real there's a real strength there. And so I'm confident that we can say free and fair elections, but one needs to be vigilant because the law does not enforce itself. And it is not enough for people to just sit back and wait for groups like the Brennan Center or attorneys general to bring lawsuits and for courts to then issue rulings, because they are not going to necessarily try to comply with those rulings unless the public is behind them, unless the public is saying enough is enough, we actually want our free and fair elections. This is true with all of the other things all the other abuses as well. So we are in a moment of extreme risk, but there is a lot of strength, and we just need to be vigilant. Don't despair, prepare, as the Attorney General already said that was done beforehand. We need to do that for the elections and keep our eye on the ball.
Anyone else want to weigh in on elections issues?
I guess I think it's important to situate us in the moment that we're in. I mean, Wendy's certainly right that what this president is claiming is both nonsense, unconstitutional, and absurd. But the reality is that it took us 4 constitutional amendments just to secure the guarantee that people of color, women, could vote in this country, and ultimately that we wouldn't impose a poll tax that would serve to disenfranchise us. So the degree of contest over election fairness and the right to vote has a long and storied and ugly history in this country, and we are seeing a particularly ugly permutation of it now from the president that is flagrantly unconstitutional and incredibly damaging. I urge all of us to remember how hard we had to fight, that people had to die to protect the right to vote. And so now when we find ourselves in a time when it's clear that there will be threats to people at polls, there will be long lines at polls, there will be extensive efforts to keep us from voting, that we shouldn't forget who came before us, how hard we fought to do it, and that it's important for us to show up to vote, to exercise our right, to make a plan, do it early, get yourself ready, and also support other people in exercising their right, whatever you think their vote will be. But that the success of our country depends on our encouraging all of us to participate in our democracy in that way. And we fought hard for it up to now. We need to fight hard for it now, too.
And whatever the U.S. Supreme Court says
Right.
in
Vote
the coming
early.
weeks.
Yes.
Yes.
Catherine, I'm going to turn the next question to you, actually. We've talked about the idea that public trust is essential for a functioning democracy.
Yeah.
We have seen an unprecedented level of federal law enforcement in the states over this past year, Minnesota being a prominent example, but also California, Illinois, numerous other states.
Yes.
What does that say about the current situation? How did we get here, and where do we go from here? And obviously, everyone else feel free to weigh on this as well.
Well, the degree of militarization of our everyday activities and the degree of visible willingness of our president and our presidential administration to turn military force against us in our everyday lives is shocking and truly dangerous and designed to make us to feel afraid and to feel like we can't participate. And so I think, we should recognize it for what it is, and we should take hope. Wendy's mentioned Minnesota and what we can take away from Minnesota. I hope what we take away is the way that communities came together. And even when it was scary, even when it was lethal, even when it was dangerous, they went toward the fight to build how we believe in ourselves, how we stand for each other, and that an inclusive democracy, an inclusive community is who we will insist on being, even when it's hard. I hate that we had such a recent and not yet over example in this very recent time, and I hope that we take from those people that when we stand for each other, we are powerful, and that there is strength in doing that. But the degree of federal fight against some among us whom the federal government disdains is is not unprecedented, and and I think that's also important for us to remember. I mean, we're seeing it on all fronts, and I think that's particularly dangerous. But when we lived through the Red Scare, it was our federal government saying that some among us shouldn't be able to participate. When we lived through the Lavender Scare, it wasn't just the gay employees in the federal government who lost their jobs, which would have been enough for that to have been horrible. But the U.S. Park Police had an actual program where they went to parks to try to hurt people because they were wanting to threaten them because they were gay. That was our federal government that was preying on our people. When we had the Japanese internment, we had people, residents of the United States, Americans, who were taken from their homes, held under armed guard with barbed wire fences in concentration camps by our federal government because our federal government was preying on us. So we've lived through moments over and over and over again in our history that are particularly painful, particularly militaristic, particularly dangerous, and we need to live through it again now. We need to say this is not who we will be as a community, and the way that we get there is that we stand for each other.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I mean, I'll just add that I think the president is really testing the limits of his authority, and he's sort of, I don't mean it to sound so casual, but he's taking them out for a spin to see how they do, and to see how National Guard deployed in LA does, and he's always weak on the law in terms of his ability to deploy, but he makes arguments that are compelling to some people. And when he says we're sending the National Guard to do the exact thing that federal law, the Posse Comitatus Act, prohibits, to enforce criminal law with military, like that's illegal. And he says that that's what they're going to do in blue cities because there's an image in some people's head that blue cities are overrun with crime and criminals, and Democrats love criminals more than they love victims, and whatever the conspiracy theory is or the propaganda that's being shared. And so some people think, if they're not going to do it, if they're not going to keep us safe, then send in the military. And so that's where the courts, where they're not political and facts and law determine the outcome, are important, and we've been able to prevail. But this idea that we're going to have militarized cities with our own military, that's one of the things that our Constitution has rejected. It's the Posse Comitatus Act and that view that we shouldn't have military engaged in civilian law enforcement on domestic soil, like that was sort of forged in the crucible of the founding of our nation and part of our DNA, like inextricably intertwined. And so, and he's trying it out to see how people feel about it today. And it's important that that be like firmly rejected. And I can't say enough about Minnesota and Minnesotans and people in Minneapolis who, like in the freezing cold, with essentially a military occupation by the federal government in their city that closed down schools and led to 2 deaths of 2 human beings that were protesting, Alex Pretty and Renee Good. They stood strong and they blew their whistles and they honked their horns and they peacefully protested until they left, until Dan Bovino was let go and eventually Secretary Noem as well. And that shows you the power of everyday people speaking up and speaking out and hitting the streets and not leaving. When we sort of started this chapter in our country, one of the things that someone shared with me, and I'll share it here, was that the 3 C's are really important: courts, crowds, and courage. And courts have been places where we've been able to bring our cases and stop unlawful actions. Courage has been exhibited by many, including Minnesotans, and not by some law firms like Paul Weiss. I will name names on this one. And it's important to stand up and not give up your rights voluntarily. And crowds is perhaps the most important of the 3 C's. When people show up, whether it be hands off or no Kings rallies, and hit the streets, not just here, but across this state in different cities and cities across the state, when millions of people have that outpouring and demand something more fair, more just, that's better, and refuse to accept what's happening and demand more of their elected officials, there's nothing more powerful than that. And that also requires courage. And part of, we've talked a lot about Trump's official actions. One of his most powerful weapons is his soft power, his unofficial actions, his threats, his intimidation, the stick that he could use if you dare to speak up, if you don't just keep your head down and stay quiet. And that silence, that being quiet, is perhaps the place where democracy will most likely die. Democracies thrive with engagement, with activism, with participation. They die in the dark with apathy and neglect. And we cannot be apathetic. We cannot neglect the nurturing that our democracy requires, and it requires meeting the moment. And this is a unique moment. It means rising to the occasion, doing more, digging deeper, asking more of yourself. I've asked more of myself and my team, and I think if we do that across our state and our nation, we're going to be in a great place.
Just one minor point to add to that, to link that back to the trust point. That also breeds trust in the Constitution, in our system, and in one another. And one of the things that autocrats try to do, or would-be autocrats, is divide us. We are very polarized, and that is, and the lack of trust and willingness to engage and be in fellowship together creates that opening for power and for people to take and consolidate power. That community trust that is bred from this action and from speaking up and from standing up from one another is part of what can break that and rebuild that foundation.
Thank you, Wendy. And Melanie, this next one is going to start with you and hopefully get feedback from all of you, and it builds on that very point. So we seem to be in a time of heightened distrust in institutions like the free press, universities, and governmental processes, and in even the concept of generally acceptable facts. How have each of you seen that show up in your work over these recent times? Where do you think things are headed with that? And just give us your thoughts.
It's not great from the perspective of a journalist. Look, I think that there has been, this is not unique to Trump, and I don't even think it's unique to any one party, but there has been like a long sort of trying to tear down or inject skepticism into the mainstream press. I do think, not to equivocate, I think that Republicans do this typically more than Democrats, but this has been a long campaign. I mean, the Media Research Center, I think, started during the Clinton era, if I have that right. I mean, so I think that this is the culmination of a lot of work to sort of tear down the mainstream media. I think that the new thing that adds just another complicating factor is, though, now how atomized our media ecosystem is. And so it's not just a matter of people maybe reading work and saying, I don't trust that or I don't believe it. They just don't have to be confronted with it. They can find their own outlets that sort of reinforce whatever their viewpoints are. I feel like we are increasingly being separated into echo chambers. And so I think that is the thing I think that worries me the most is less so that I don't mind getting reader mail that tells me that they disagree with what I say, even if what I say are accurate facts. I think what worries me is if they've stopped reading and now they're listening to the podcasts that just sort of trumpet back to them what they'd like to hear. So that's a bummer. I don't know what the solution is, unfortunately. Subscribe to Politico, but I think, and your local newspaper, more importantly. But I think that is absolutely going to be a trend that is just going to be exacerbated in these next few elections, because if people can sort of pick and choose the type of information that they're getting, then we no longer have sort of a common basis of what our understanding of the facts are, and I think that only heightens the distrust going forward.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Sure. Just to build on that, I mean, I think that a lot of the trends we've been talking about are products of the media environment, which has changed a lot. I mean, everyone should get their news from sources like Politico, but you know, maybe not people here, but most young people get their news instead from sources like TikTok, which explains why Trump, in one of his most illegal actions, suspended the law requiring you know, TikTok to be sold. So I think the effects are complicated, but it definitely it's an immediate environment where it's hard to penetrate. Politicians are looking for ways to penetrate the media environment, and really acute conflict does that. So it kind of creates incentives for. I mean, Trump, he succeeded by excelling at navigating this sort of media environment, coming in as a complete political outsider, dominating the system through his ability to manage this new media environment. And one of the strategies for doing that is generating conflict that draws attention to issues and perspectives that are favorable to you, or just keeps him in the news. So I think one has to be aware of that, and I think everyone's going to have to figure out how to navigate this new sort of environment. But a second point, maybe more hopeful, is I think we've been talking about how courts are a really important check. I think it's really important to kind of, for you as law students and lawyers generally, it's important to kind of go issue by issue and try to get out of this, the media environment, the partisanship in general kind of encourages, you see issues all the time, they kind of go through this buzzsaw, and then all of a sudden people are divided on some issue that they weren't divided about that long ago. And I think one has to try and resist that, try and go issue by issue. And I think that's particularly important for lawyers because this is what courts have to do, and it's what really sustains durable checks, is to have the legal system, develop consistent rules, apply them in an even-handed way. But that requires, not just assuming that your side always has the law in its favor, but trying to go issue by issue and think, well, what's really the right answer in this particular case? So it's good training for lawyers. I mean, you always have to think about what the other side is going to say on any issue, but I think it's also important for sustaining really important institutions to make sure you're not just always assuming your preferred side is right, but trying to think more objectively.
Thank you. We want to take some time to open the floor for a couple of questions. So does anyone want to ask a question to our panelists?
So thank you guys for being here. It's going to be a bit of a long question, so bear with me. But all right. So given the federal government's March 13th use of the Defense Production Act to override California's pipeline restrictions, and California's lawsuit just filed this week, maybe getting us closer to the 120, how do you see this conflict shaping the future of the state's resistance in an era of transactional federalism?
Maybe I'll take that one since my office brought the two lawsuits in this case, but you're talking about our second one where the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, issued an order invoking the Defense Production Act and essentially is trying to, Sable Oil Company is trying to rely on that order to reopen operations in a place where, instead we're talking about Santa Barbara County, we're talking about the 2015 Refugio oil spill. It's the same pipeline. And there have been court orders that have been imposed to ensure safety going forward. There's an ongoing federal consent decree. There's right now a preliminary injunction in Santa Barbara Superior Court. And it is a completely inappropriate invocation of the Defense Production Act. It relies on this so-called national energy emergency. There isn't one. We produce far more oil than we use. We have more than enough for our own use. What really puts the lie to the national energy emergency is that it only focuses on fossil fuel. It doesn't focus at all on solar or wind power. So it's not really about energy and the security of the grid and the reliability of the grid and access to sufficient energy. It's about a giveaway to the fossil fuel industry. And context for situational awareness is Trump met with big oil execs who committed, I think it was, or he asked for $1 billion or whatever it was for his campaign. This appears to be his payback. This Defense Production Act, usually you need to have a justification that is consistent with the statute. We don't have that here. You usually need to say what needs to be produced, how much, and during what periods of time. That's not in there. Usually it's a production that is supposed to support the government and requires a contract with the government to compensate the entity for what they're producing, and they're not doing that here either. They're asking Sable to contract with other private parties. So it's not consistent with the Defense Production Act. We also think it's inconsistent with the separation of powers because the Defense Production Act doesn't provide for an overriding of existing court orders like the federal and the state court order that I just mentioned. We also believe it violates our state sovereignty because it opens up a pipeline in a place where there's a state park, where there's been no authority to operate the pipeline there. So this is another sort of very brazen attempt for Trump to just ram through the thing that he wants. And it's bad and it's good that he's sloppy and detached from the law, and it gives us a lot to work with when we go to court. So we think we're going to prevail here. It does increase the tension between states and federal government, but I think it will be ultimately, sooner than later, slapped down in the court of law.
Hi, thank you so much to all of you for your comments. My question is sort of a question/comment. My question is about the recent Pam Bondi proposal, thank you for nodding, to strip the state bars of their authority to regulate lawyers, federal government lawyers in the Department of Justice. I think traditionally that's been an area where states have had the ability to control. We're a law school, these are law students, we're lawyers. States have been the ones where they regulate us, our ethical practices, our behaviors. Pam Bondi has now presented a regulation that would allow the Department of Justice to do its own inquiries. I wonder if you could speak about that, and I would also like to just remind everyone that public comments on this proposed regulation are open until April 6th, and it's a great idea for everyone in the room to do a public comment. But please, maybe you could reinforce that for me.
I'll just add a couple of notes for all of you law students and aspiring lawyers. You are bound by the ethical rules of the state in which you are barred, no matter what boss or Pam Bondi it tells you otherwise. And so this regulation it's not only deeply problematic, but it is not supported by law. So I think that if it does ever become a regulation, it will be challenged, and I don't think will survive. The Department of Justice lawyers are, pursuant to statute and other policy, actually bound under federal law to follow their state bar rules. But it is another example of trying to use the levers of federal power to take away other nodes of checks on abuse of power. So this is state bars are, again, a lot of the bad things that somebody might want to do in order to abuse power requires lawyers to carry them out. As it turns out, a lot of lawyers don't want to do things that might get them disbarred subsequently, because those things would be unethical. And in fact, the threat of that kind of enforcement under state law or their own ethical compass is a real deterrent to getting people to do stuff. And we've seen many, many people across the Department of Justice actually resign when asked to take unlawful actions, to bring baseless prosecutions, or otherwise violate the law and their ethical responsibilities. And this is an attempt and end run around that. Like, that's a check. It's been working. It makes it harder to get people to carry out unlawful orders, so they're trying to remove that check or make it harder to be exercised. The law students should speak up about this. This is actually, this is a time to speak about the voice of, to stand up for the kind of legal system you want to practice in, and for the strength and nobility of the profession that you're entering.
Do we have time for one last question? I'm going to let Megan choose.
All right, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, woo, this round.
Okay, so I've definitely heard that like the president's definitely trying to test how much power he can wield and just see whether they can get away with. And a lot of the congressmen in DC are kind of letting the Republicans see how much power they can wield. So I'm just wondering what you think about some of the elected officials that are Republicans in DC, like Tillis and Toon, who seem to have a good moral conscience, just the role that they play, just taking a stand and kind of speaking across the aisle that way.
Morality and civic responsibility should know no party. And the best times in our country have come when people have said, those who are like me, those who are my party, have done wrong, and I will speak against it. I mean, what happened following the Watergate scandal was that we had a national consensus, including among Republicans, that it was unacceptable for the president to behave that way. And we shouldn't find ourselves at that brinksmanship to need to turn where we are. And I'm very grateful when any among us is willing to stand for justice and is willing to stand for ethics and is willing to stand for our highest aspirations as a country.
All right, thank you all. Thank you, panelists. This has been fantastic. We so appreciate you joining us this evening. Thank you all for your questions. And we have food and beverages, so please enjoy and feel free to come up and say hello if you have additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
What's that?
That would be great. So get a picture real quick, you all.